Hello, welcome to Philosophy of the Arts. This is my teaching assistant, Finn, and he will be helping us think about Martin Heidegger's Poetically Man Dwells. So you're already a little bit familiar with Heidegger's writings because you read Art and Space during our section on sculpture. So you're familiar that he is kind of a mysterious, enigmatic philosopher. He's very poetic. He makes sentences, but he says he wants them to be more like questions. And so he's not exactly a straightforward linear thinker who lays it all out for you. So that gives us a lot of room to kind of play with his ideas and think through them for ourselves. So he wrote Poetically Man Dwells as a speech, which he gave in 1951. And this speech is collected with a number of other works he wrote on poetry and art. And the volume is called Poetry, Language, and Thought. And he also has many other writings on Hölderlin's poetry and other poets. So he wrote and thought and gave a lot of lectures on poetry if you want to know more about what he thinks about poetry. In this speech for today, he is talking about Hölderlin's poem In Lovely Blue. The title, Poetically Man Dwells, comes from this particular poem. So I want to give you a little bit of an idea of what Hölderlin's poetry is like, so you get this background for his speech. So the poem In Lovely Blue starts, "In lovely blue, the steeple blossoms with its metal roof, around which drift swallow cries, around which lies most loving blue. The sun high overhead tints the roof tin, but up in the wind silent, the weathercock crows." It's a long poem, so I'm not going to read the rest of it, but it should give you an idea that he is a very imagistic poetry. He's calling our attention to different sensations and to try to kind of set this mood. And if you can read Hölderlin in the original German, you see that he's got this very distinctive rhythm to his language. It sounds a particular way. He often sort of interrupts or creates these silences, and there's a strong beat to his poetry as well. And so he's definitely a poet who really has a sense of the way words feel in your mouth and the way it feels to say them. And Poetically Man Dwells on this earth is the line from this poem that Heidegger wants to consider. So Heidegger starts out his lecture by questioning this idea of poetically man dwells. He says, you know, dwelling and poetry seem two radically opposed activities. They seem very different from each other. And he starts out by describing dwelling. He says, "Does not all dwelling remain incompatible with the poetic? Our dwelling is harassed by the housing shortage, harassed by work, made insecure by the hunt for gain and success, bewitched by the entertainment and recreation industry." Right, so Heidegger is pointing out our homes, you know, they seem to be a consumer good. They seem to be something we work really hard for. You know, we have to gain a house, we have to make money, we have to kind of use our house as a symbol of success. Like, I have reached this financial stage where I'm a homeowner. And it's also bewitched by entertainment and recreation industry, right? This sort of way we can put a lot of consumer goods in our home and kind of celebrate being at home in these different ways through entertainment. And he's thinking about the way that we kind of, you know, have this packaged notion of what a home is. Right, so that doesn't seem particularly poetic. That has to do with our sort of industriousness and the sort of economy that we belong to. It's not something particularly poetic. And then he makes the point, you know, even when there's still room left in today's dwelling for the poetic, you know, when you're not working, when you're not striving hard, when you kind of set some time aside, he says, what comes to pass is at best a preoccupation with aestheticizing, whether in writing or the air. So what he means by this is that we end up having to set aside time, but we fill it with beauty, but not in ways that are particularly meaningful. It's just aesthetic, right? It might just be pleasing in a particular way, whether that's putting a beautiful painting in my house so it looks nice, or kind of playing some nice music so that while I'm cooking a meal, it feels nice, or kind of having a TV show on or something else that's artistic. These are just kind of ways of filling up this space. And it's not a particularly meaningful or sort of fulfilling achievement. So again, when we bring the poetic into this idea of dwelling, it doesn't seem necessarily to have much depth. And on the other hand, poetry seems pretty opposed to this very practical, pragmatic idea of dwelling. He says that poetry is either rejected as frivolous, mooning, and vaporizing into the unknown, and a flight into the dreamland, or it is counted as a part of literature. Right, so we have this idea of the poet as having their head in the sky, you know, being among the clouds, mooning, right, being in a dream world. And so that doesn't seem very connected to this earth, this world, this practical sort of demands of life, right, where we need a home above our heads. And, you know, or it just kind of becomes a part of literature. And so poetry, it doesn't seem to be particularly related to life in a meaningful way. So to change this concept of poetry as a sort of dreamy, otherworldly approach to life, Heidegger wants to get back to this ancient Greek term for poetry. So poetry comes from the word poesis, which in ancient Greek means to make. So poesis is a making, just like carpentry is a making or farming is a making. There's lots of ways of cultivating and making and developing things. And so Heidegger thinks if we think of poetry in this way as poesis, as an activity of making and creating, we can kind of bring poetry down to earth a little bit and think about it maybe in a more concrete and more in a way that's actually tied to our daily activities. And he also wants to change the way we think about dwelling. He's not interested in this idea of dwelling in a home, not this very literal sense of here's my house and I live in it. He is thinking about dwelling as something that we do existentially, something that involves our very being, the very core of who we are. So what does it mean to dwell is also a part of this essay. What does it mean to kind of live here and be here and exist here? He says, this does not mean, though, that the poetic is merely an ornament and bonus added to dwelling. So when he's thinking of poetic dwelling, he's not saying that you just add poetry on like a little hat or a little ornament or something that kind of makes it flashier. Nor does the poetic character of dwelling mean merely that the poetic turns up in some way or another in dwelling. So it's not like poetry just kind of shows up every once in a while. So instead, the phrase poetically man dwells says poetry first causes dwelling to be dwelling. Poetry is what really lets us dwell. Right? So he's saying it's not like poetry and dwelling kind of get added in these sporadic or spontaneous ways or kind of liminally related. Poetry really lets us dwell. Poetry is fundamental to dwelling. And he says, but through what do we attain a dwelling place? What does this mean? Right? And he says it's through building, right? If poesis is a type of making or building or creation, then poetry kind of creates a world for us to dwell in. Poetic creation, which lets us dwell, is a kind of building. This is the way he wants to think of poetry. Poetry is this sort of world creation, and it's not an other world that we create. It's the world that we live in, that we create through poetry. And he gives these different ways of thinking about what poetic dwelling involves, like what kind of activity is this? What kind of, building or creation is this? And he talks about it as a type of listening. So poetry involves this sort of sensitive listening and receptiveness. He talks about it as responding and echoing what it hears. And he talks about it building in terms of cultivating and caring, which is also a type of sort of responsiveness and receptivity. And he says that in doing this, we develop a sense of belonging. This makes us have a relationship to where we build and what we create and the things around us in this active creation. And then later in the essay, he brings it back to Herderlin's poem, where Herderlin describes man measuring things and kind of spanning in these immense spaces. Like poetry allows us to measure and span. Okay, so I am going to go through these one by one so that we get a better sense of what Heidegger means by each of these. He says, man acts as though he were the shaper and master of language, while in fact language remains the master of man. Right, so this is an important point that Heidegger makes, is we think we're in charge of language, but actually what we're able to express and think and do is dependent on language, right? So language in a way comes first and moves us. He says, for strictly it is language that speaks. Man first speaks when and only when he responds to language by listening to its appeal. Language beckons us. So this is really important, right? Language is something we respond to, right? So a good poet is someone who really understands language as a medium. Like, what does language feel like and sound like, and what can language express, and what exactly does this word do, or ending on this syllable, what effect does that have, right? So the poet has to really have this understanding of how language beckons and calls to us and how we respond to it. And so the poet ends up being kind of receptive of language. Like that's what Heidegger's thinking of, is the poet is someone who is a really good listener, who receives language and can kind of call after it and respond to it. So the poetry ends up being almost like an echo for Heidegger. And this echo isn't just merely repeating, it's kind of carrying the sound along so that we ourselves can feel this resonance. If you haven't watched the Art of Metaphor video that I posted already, please pause this video lecture and quickly watch that. In the Art of Metaphor video, they talk about the fact that metaphors have this sort of profound power because they describe something by something else, right? And so it's this interesting sort of bringing different things together that help us to think more about what something is. And that seems indirect or roundabout. Why not just talk about this X? Why talk about Y to understand X? But this is kind of how our minds work. We are these pattern machines. We're always looking for connections, and we're always trying to draw connections to make sense of things. And so what a metaphor does is it kind of amplifies what something is, right? It conjures an entire scene. And that's partly because it involves using our imagination and our senses, right? So our experience of something is really, really complex. And sometimes when we put words to it, we might simplify it. But a metaphor keeps that complexity there, right? It kind of gestures and points towards things. And it doesn't always fill out everything, right? If we say there's an elephant in the room or something like that, we get this kind of sense of that feeling from that metaphor. And so the words that are given, elephant in the room, express more than just the literal sense. And poetic metaphors do something special too, where they require us to look at the world through new eyes, right? So if I hear a poem by Carl Sandburg about the fog comes on little cat feet, right? Then every time I experience fog, I think of that idea of a cat walking alongside the harbor, right? And it gives me this different sense of what fog is, and at the same time captures exactly what my experience of fog has been like, right? So it kind of renews my experience in a particular way. And so I feel a more intimate relationship with my world when I read a poem, and it helps me to feel my world more deeply. It opens up a new world for me in a sense by helping me to look at that world differently. So Heidegger tells us that, poetry helps us dwell on earth. When he's talking about dwelling, he means on this earth. It's about being connected to the world. He says poetry does not fly above and surmount the earth in order to escape it, right? Poetry is not about escapism for him. He says poetry is what first brings man onto the earth, making him belong to it, and thus brings him into dwelling. Right. So if we think about that idea of the metaphor and how it's connected to our sort of very sensory experiences, poetry helps us be very rooted in our sort of first experience of the world, the sort of way we experience and move around in the world becomes more vivid to us. Poetry kind of gives us the words that evoke those original feelings. So here's a poem that I think does that really well. Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Right, so this is just 2 lines. This is a very simple image poem where we're given 2 juxtapositions, right? You've been on a crowded metro and you know what it's like to see all these faces lined up together. And Ezra Pound compares it to petals on a wet black bough. Right? So now you have this image of, instead of a line of people, you have this beautiful sort of natural image. And bringing them together gives this particular feel, right? When you're out in an urban crowded space and it can feel chaotic, and then suddenly you notice how beautiful it is. And so that sort of juxtaposition Pound gives us reminds us of these experiences we have where we find beauty in these sort of ordinary, very mundane moments. And even my expression and explanation of this poem really doesn't do as much as this poem does. You have to read it out loud. You have to experience it. You have to savor this poem in order to really get that experience. The other way that Heidegger talks about poetry is it's a type of measure taking. And this is what he takes directly out of Hölderlin's poem in Lovely Blueness, right? Hölderlin is talking about man spanning things, man measuring things. So Heidegger says, the taking of measure is what is poetic indwelling. Poetry is a measuring. But what is it to measure, right? What does it mean to measure? He doesn't mean measure in like feet or inches or centimeters. He doesn't mean measuring in a sort of calculative or scientific way. He doesn't mean measuring in a way that determines exactly what things are. When we talk about taking measure, right, this is a more open sense. It's sort of like taking things in and seeing how they are and drawing relations between things. He says, poetry is presumably a high and special kind of measuring, but there is more. In poetry, there takes place what all measuring is in the ground of its being. Okay, so this is a big statement. Heidegger is saying all forms of measuring we can possibly think of, right? Measuring your height, measuring the days of the year, measuring the growth of something, measuring, I don't know, economic stability, who knows what you might measure. But he says that poetry is kind of the first grounding measure. It's the first way that we take measure of anything, right? So he's saying any other way we have of relating to the world is secondary. And poetry is the first way that we relate to the world. So measuring kind of involves making sense of things, trying to figure out what they are, how they relate, growth, change, development, what we can do, planning, all sorts of things come from some form of measuring. And Heidegger is saying the first form of measuring we ever partake in is poetry. That's where measuring begins. And everything else is some sort of derivation or secondary version of that poetic measuring. He is thinking of poetic measuring in relation to what he calls the fourfold. And so there's four dynamics he's kind of thinking of. There's the gods, immortality, the sort of expansiveness of things, the mysteriousness, what's hidden and not here. And then there's mortals, which is, us, our mortality, our finitude, the fact that our lives have a beginning and an end, right? They're not infinite, and we don't have infinite access to everything. And mortals belong to earth, and they're under the sky. And just as the gods and mortals have this relation, the sky and earth have this relation. So Hölderlin's poem discusses the sky and gods and earth and mortals. And Heidegger's thinking of this measure between these, differences. Like poetry happens in between these sort of spaces where you have things connecting to each other and being drawn together. And so the gods are the gods and they're distinct from the mortals. But in order to understand immortality, you kind of have to understand mortality. And mortals are not the gods. But Heidegger, in this poem, is thinking about the fact that mortals have to understand themselves in relation to the gods, right? As not being infinite, as not being gods, in order to understand their mortality. And the earth and sky have this sort of similar relation, where we see the sort of limits of the earth in relation to the sky. And so Heidegger is describing this sort of measuring between different aspects of existence. And so existence is this kind of in-between space. And this is what poetry is trying to measure for us, is relations and how things come together. So a poem I think illustrates this idea really well is Mark Strand's Keeping Things Whole. In a field, I am the absence of field. This is always the case. Wherever I am what is missing. When I walk, I part the air, and always the air moves in to fill the spaces where my body's been. We all have reasons for moving. I move to keep things whole. Right, so this poem, I mean, this is one of my favorite poems, and every time I read it, I feel like I get something different out of it. But one of the things Strand is drawing our attention to is the way things relate to each other in terms of presence and absence, and this idea of being in this space, right, where you change the space around you, right? So the way things are being measured, the way you move, the way he, as a poet, is drawing things in relation to each other, I think really describes what Heidegger is thinking about when he's talking about poetic measure, right? So you can sit with this poem, you can pause the video if you want to and read through it on your own and think about, what is Mark Strand measuring here? What is he making more vivid? What is he helping us to understand? And what aspects are maybe relating to each other in a different way in terms of how he set up this poem? So if we bring all these ideas together, this sort of listening and receptivity, this openness to language and listening to how language speaks to us and creating out of that in ways that let us sort of be connected to the earth and have a more vivid sense of our connection to the earth, and also create spaces where we're thinking about the relation of things between each other. We're sort of measuring and creating this sort of in-between space where everything can kind of come into connection. This is how Heidegger is trying to think about poetic dwelling. And so for him, our existence, sort of living fully, being on this earth, has a lot to do with being poetic, being open, being attentive, being a listener, being receptive. And poetry is fundamentally a form of dwelling, right? It helps us to be a part of this world and to kind of create the world that we're a part of. So Heidegger says that poetry and dwelling not only do not exclude each other, on the contrary, poetry and dwelling belong together, each calling for the other. So the other poem I want you to look at is Sofia, Elegios, To Make Use of Water. And I shared the video where she reads it out loud, so you get to hear the poem in her voice. And then I also shared an interview with the poet. So you can hear her talking about why she composed it, what words were kind of sticking in her head, how she was feeling, and kind of where this poem came from. And so I want you to think about this poem in relation to Heidegger's Poetically Man Dwells. And I want you to think about your reaction to Elle Helo's poem. I want you to think about how she's using poetry to help her to dwell. And I want you to think about how this poem might help you dwell and help you to think about your dwelling. So I hope you can kind of put all these ideas together, and I'm looking forward to all you have to say in the discussion board. Thank you.